Shalom, this is YouTube number 6 regarding the imbroglio, the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. I left off in the last YouTube with World War II and the German, very great German victory in Russia until the turning of the tide at the Battle of Stalingrad. And as I promised in the last YouTube, I wanted to tell you a story. Very long story, I won't tell you the full details. I won a ticket, free raffle ticket, airline ticket to Moscow in 1994. And I was studying the Jewish Theological Seminary to become a conservative rabbi at the time. In the end, I didn't become a rabbi, but I had the 3 most wonderful years of my life in seminary studying God's Word. And I went to Moscow. And I met up, also another long story I won't go into, I met a lady who had a radio show on Radio Moscow. And she said to me, "Who are you?" And I told her who I was, and that I work mostly in churches speaking about the threat of Islam. And she saw that I spoke Russian, but I didn't speak a very good Russian really for a radio show, especially on Radio Moscow. And she said, "Would you do a show?" I said, "Yes, but the only thing is we have to do all the questions and answers in writing in advance so that I don't make a complete fool of myself." And so we did. I worked 4 hours with the questions and answers, and basically they read me the questions and I read back the answers, and I know somewhere in the vaults of Radio Moscow or the KGB or FSB, whatever you want to call it, they have that interview. And I'm very proud of the interview that I made. And I said on the radio show, the thrust of the 1-hour interview was that I said to the Russian people, I said, "America is not your enemy anymore. This is 1994 after the fall of communism. Europe is not your enemy anymore. Israel and the Jews are not your enemy anymore. The enemy of Russia is and has always been the Muslims. For 1,000 years, the Russian people have been fighting. Mother Russia, the church, have been fighting Islam for 1,000 years. It's simple history. All you have to do is read the books." During the interview, he said to me, "Well, you know, we are not communist Russia anymore, but all of us in the radio station are still communists, and we believe in something called the solidarity of all nations," meaning that the one new man in Marx, as I mentioned in previous shows, instead of the one new man in Christ, as it says in Ephesians for Christians, in the communist world, they said the one new man in Marx. And I said, "That's nonsense." I said, "You know, you have been fighting the Muslims, and you got to realize that this is the threat not only to Russia, it is the threat to the world today. And this has been my work for the last 25 years. And so he said to me, "You're right," he said to me. "I will tell you something. All Russian school children learn the Battle of Stalingrad in their history books. The Battle of Stalingrad was a horrible battle which took place over a period of 2 years. From 1941 to 1943. In the end, the Russians lost their whole army there, 250,000 men were trapped. But the Russians paid very dearly. When the German armies decided to surrender, when they were encircled by the Red Army, there were 250,000 Nazi troops and Nazi allied troops, including Spanish, Italian, Romanian, Hungarian, and also they had a special unit of Muslims who were SS Gestapo, who came from Palestine. As I said before, the Jews who were Palestinians, British Palestinians, fought in the British army, and the Muslims fought in the Nazi armies. And when the decision was taken that all of the Nazi armies would surrender to the Red Army, the only group which refused to surrender and fought to the death were these Muslims, Chechens, Albanians, and Palestinians, and others. And they put their bayonets on their guns, and they made a last-minute charge at the Russian defenses with daggers in their teeth. And of course, the Red Army machine gunners mowed them all down. So, like I said before, my whole life is like stamp collecting, but instead of stamps, it's evidence collecting on these wars of over 1,000 years with Islam. And of course, the wars between the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Poles, and the Russians and the Poles and the Russians, Eastern Europe has had a very bloody history. I spoke about this. So we get to the end of World War II, and Stalin, horrible man. I would say Stalin was as horrible as Hitler. And he killed also tens of millions of people. And Stalin also suffered from a number of health problems. And I don't know if you could call it senility or dementia, but all of a sudden he decided that he was going to kill all the Jews in Russia. And God took him. Stalin died on the Jewish holiday of Purim, 1953. And for all those Jews and Christians who know the scroll of Esther, we are talking about a holiday of miraculous salvation of the Jews from death at the hands of Haman. And in this case, it was Stalin of Russia who decided to wipe out the Jewish people. Hitler tried it, killed a third of our people. Stalin tried it. Stalin killed at least 1 million Jews in these communist purges. And so in 1953, Stalin dies. Who replaces him? Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was a Ukrainian communist. And the war, that now after 5 YouTubes, we're in our 6th YouTube now we're going to start talking about the war in the Ukraine. What happened was that Ukraine today is divided into two. You have the ancient traditional Ukraine, which is to the west, half the country, and that half of the Ukraine, today's Ukraine, excuse me, are Catholic, Roman Catholic, with a history of hundreds of years of fighting the Russians. And in 1954, a year after Khrushchev comes to power, remember, Khrushchev is also a communist and he's also a Ukrainian. And he does something which today is called Khrushchev's folly. He takes areas, industrial areas of Russia, bordering on the Ukraine, and he gives them as a gift to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. You have to remember, all these republics of the Soviet Union are autonomous, but they're part of the Soviet Union. It's kind of like if, for example, Texas all of a sudden was given Oklahoma as a gift. I know the Texans and Oklahomans will kill me for saying this. And then let's say Texas breaks away. And the Oklahomans say, hey, no, we don't want to break away. We want to stay with the United States. And then Russia, China, Venezuela decide we're going to help Texas to break away from the United States. Washington, D.C. is not going to be very happy about it. So what Khrushchev did was he gave Russian areas, double the size of the Ukraine, and which is okay as long as the Ukraine is part of the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union broke up in 1989, 1990, the Ukrainians took all this new Russian territory, which was never Ukraine, including Crimea, and they said, you know what? We have this new empire called Greater Ukraine, and we have a very big, sizable Russian-speaking majority. And the very first thing the Ukrainian government did was they banned the use of Russian. It said to the Russians, you're not going to speak Russian anymore. From now on, you're going to speak Ukrainian. Don't forget, Ukrainian, Polish, Russian, they're all Slavic languages, but they're different from each other. And I'm not justifying Vladimir Putin and the Russians who are fighting the Ukrainian central government in Kiev, but a lot of the Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine are not happy with the suppression of their Russian culture. And this is one of the explanations for the unrest in the eastern Ukraine. So what we see today now is we see the Russians now thinking about how are we going to fix the mistake that Khrushchev made in 1954. We have to return these Russian-speaking lands to Russia. And Vladimir Putin went on record as saying, and I understand him from his perspective, he said that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the worst disaster to happen to Russia in the 20th century. And so now what you have is you have countries like the Ukraine, countries like, it used to be Georgia, but Abkhazia and Ossetia breaking away. These are Russian-speaking areas of Georgia. You have Transnistria, which is an eastern part of Moldova, which is actually Romanian. I wouldn't be surprised one day if the Russians go for Transnistria, and Moldova might eventually break away and join Romania. and reform the greater Romania. You have in Latvia, 40% of Latvia are Russian speakers. And so there's a lot of talk in Latvia also of the suppression of Russian culture and forcing the Russian speakers not to speak Russian, but to speak Latvian. I'm going to speak in the next YouTube about Islam and about a very important subject which is connected to Russia, is connected to what we know today as the one world government, something we know that is happening also with NAFTA, with Mexico, Canada, and the US. And all of these forces come to play in understanding the war between Russia and the East versus US, Europe, and the West, the Eastern Orthodox churches versus the Western churches, Protestant and Catholic. And I think you can call it Russia versus the one world government. So stay tuned for the 7th YouTube.